At exactly 11:47 on a Thursday night, Victoria Grant realized something was wrong. Not because the police had arrived, not because someone had broken into the house, and not because her husband had finally confronted her. The problem was much simpler. Alexander wasn't home, and for the first time in 12 years of marriage, Victoria had absolutely no idea where he was. She stood at the top of the grand staircase inside the Grant estate, staring at the antique clock mounted on the opposite wall. 11:47. The second hand moved slowly. Tick, tick, tick. The sound seemed unusually loud in the enormous house. The Grant estate was normally filled with quiet activity. Security personnel moved around the property. Housekeepers prepared for the following morning. Drivers came and went. Phones rang. Doors opened and closed. But tonight, the house was almost unnaturally silent. The staff had retired to their quarters. The security system was operating normally. The cameras were recording. The gates were locked. Everything appeared perfectly safe. And yet Victoria felt something was terribly wrong. She looked down at her phone. No missed calls. No messages. Nothing from Alexander. She called him. Straight to voicemail. She waited. Then called again. Nothing. Victoria walked downstairs. She entered the kitchen. Nothing. She checked the living room. Nothing. She returned toward the staircase. Still nothing. She tried to reassure herself. Alexander sometimes worked late. His business empire stretched across several industries. His schedule could be unpredictable. There were private meetings, investment discussions, board meetings, international calls. He could disappear into his office for hours without realizing how late it had become. But there was one thing about Alexander that had always been predictable. He communicated. If he was going to be late, he sent a message. If he was traveling, she knew. If he was meeting someone, his assistant usually knew. Tonight, nobody knew anything. Victoria walked toward the enormous glass windows overlooking the driveway. The road leading to the estate disappeared into darkness. No headlights. No approaching vehicle. Nothing. She checked her phone again. Then something happened. The phone vibrated. Victoria froze. One message. No name. No number she recognized. Just 3 words. He knows everything. Victoria stared at the screen. Her expression changed. She read it again. He knows everything. Her fingers tightened around the phone. Then another message appeared. You should leave. Victoria stopped breathing for a moment. She looked toward the front door. Then toward the security cameras. Someone was watching her. But who? And what did they mean? She took one step toward the door. Then stopped. A distant sound reached the house. An engine. Victoria turned toward the windows. Headlights appeared beyond the trees. Her heart began pounding. The vehicle came closer. She knew that car. Alexander. Her husband had returned. But then Victoria noticed something else. Another pair of headlights followed behind him. A second vehicle entered the driveway. Victoria stood completely still. Alexander's car stopped. The driver's door opened. Alexander stepped out. He looked calm. Almost too calm. Then the second vehicle stopped behind him. Victoria couldn't see who was inside. And suddenly, a memory she had spent months trying to bury came rushing back. Daniel Mercer. The man she had secretly been meeting. The man Alexander had once trusted. The man who had promised her that everything would work out. The man who had repeatedly told her, Alexander will never know. But Daniel had been wrong. Because Alexander already knew. He knew about the meetings. He knew about the second phone. He knew about the hotel rooms. He knew about the conversations concerning his money. And he knew Victoria had been lying to him. What Victoria didn't know was exactly how much Alexander knew. And more importantly, what he intended to do about it. To understand how Alexander Grant ended up standing outside his own home with the truth about his marriage in his hands, we have to go back. Back before the billions. Before the mansion. Before Victoria. Before Daniel. Back to a young boy who learned very early that security could disappear overnight. Alexander Grant wasn't born wealthy. His childhood home was comfortable, but modest. His father worked long hours. His mother carefully managed every expense. There were no private jets, no luxury vacations, no family trust, no enormous inheritance waiting for Alexander when he became an adult. There were bills, budgets, savings, and constant conversations about money. Alexander remembered one winter particularly well. He was 11 years old. Snow covered the streets outside their home. His father came through the front door after work. He looked exhausted. He removed his coat, sat at the kitchen table, and placed several envelopes in front of him. His mother brought him coffee. Alexander watched from the doorway. His parents spoke quietly. He couldn't hear everything, but he heard one sentence. "We'll figure it out." His father always said that. "We'll figure it out." Alexander didn't understand why those words stayed with him. Years later, he would. His father wasn't promising that everything would be fine. He was promising that they would survive. That moment shaped Alexander. He decided that if he ever had a family, they would never have to sit around a kitchen table wondering how the bills would be paid. He wanted security, freedom, control over his future. But more than anything, he wanted to make sure nobody he loved would ever have to experience the helplessness he had seen in his father's eyes. After college, Alexander started a technology company. His first office was almost laughably small. 3 desks, 2 computers, 1 printer that constantly malfunctioned. Alexander slept on a couch more than once. He worked until 2 in the morning, sometimes until sunrise. His first company failed. Completely. He lost almost everything he had invested. Friends told him to stop. One told him, "You've proven you can't do this." Alexander never forgot that sentence. He started again. The second company survived. Barely. The third attempt changed everything. Alexander developed a software platform that attracted the attention of a major investor. The investment gave him the opportunity he needed. Customers arrived. Employees joined. Other investors followed. Then came acquisitions, partnerships, international expansion. Within 2 decades, Alexander Grant had transformed himself from an ambitious young entrepreneur into one of the wealthiest businessmen in America. His companies were worth billions. He owned properties in several cities. His name appeared on business magazines. He attended international conferences. Politicians wanted photographs with him. Celebrities wanted invitations to his events. Charities wanted his support. And strangers wanted his friendship. Alexander learned something important. When you become wealthy, people don't always see you. Sometimes they see what you can give them. That made him careful. He learned to distinguish between people who cared about Alexander and people who cared about Alexander Grant's money. Then, he met Victoria. It happened at a charity event in Manhattan. Alexander hadn't wanted to attend. He had spent most of the week in meetings. He was exhausted. He wanted to go home. But his foundation was sponsoring the event. So he went. He stood near the edge of the ballroom, speaking with several executives. Then he saw Victoria. She wasn't standing near the wealthy donors. She wasn't trying to meet celebrities. She wasn't looking around for important people. In fact, she barely noticed Alexander. Eventually, circumstances brought them together. Alexander introduced himself. Victoria smiled. They began talking. But she didn't ask about his company. She didn't ask how much money he had. She didn't ask where he lived. Instead, she asked, "Did you always want to be a businessman?" Alexander smiled. "No. What did you want to be?" He thought about it. "I honestly don't remember." Victoria laughed. "That's a terrible answer." Alexander laughed too. And something about the conversation felt different. She was interested in the person, not the billionaire. They continued talking. Then they started seeing each other. The relationship moved quickly. Victoria met Alexander's family. Alexander met hers. They traveled. They talked about the future. They laughed. They argued. They learned each other's habits. Within a year, they were married. Alexander believed he had found something money couldn't buy: trust. For years, he believed he was right. Victoria supported him. She attended charity events. She helped organize family gatherings. She stood beside him during business difficulties. When Alexander's mother became ill, Victoria spent time with the family. Alexander remembered those years as some of the happiest of his life. They weren't perfect. No marriages. But they were real. At least, that's what he believed. For 12 years, Alexander never seriously questioned his wife's loyalty. Until small things began changing. And the first warning was so insignificant. He almost ignored it. Victoria changed the way she used her phone. Before, she had never cared who saw it. She left it on the kitchen counter. She answered calls in front of Alexander. She left it charging beside the bed. Then suddenly, the phone was always with her. Bathroom, kitchen, bedroom, living room, everywhere. Whenever a message arrived, Victoria would glance at the screen, then lock it. Sometimes she smiled. Sometimes she walked away. Alexander noticed. But he said nothing. He didn't want to become suspicious. He didn't want to become the husband who questioned every movement. So he trusted her. Then the late nights began. "I'm meeting some friends. There's a charity meeting. Someone needs my help." The explanations were believable. That was what made them dangerous. There was no obvious lie. Nothing Alexander could point to. Nothing dramatic enough to justify an accusation. Then one evening, Victoria asked a strange question. They were sitting in the kitchen. She was drinking coffee. Alexander. Yes. Have you protected everything? He looked at her. Protected everything from what? She laughed. Nothing. I'm just asking. Alexander smiled. You have to be more specific. She hesitated. What happens if something happens to you? Alexander's expression changed. Why are you asking? Because you're worth so much. You have companies everywhere. Properties. Investments. I just wonder what happens if you're gone. Alexander watched her carefully. I have plans. What kind? Estate plans. She smiled. Good. Then she changed the subject. Alexander let it go. But months later, he remembered every word. Because shortly afterward, a financial report landed on his desk. One transaction stood out. A company Alexander didn't recognize had received money connected to a consulting arrangement. The amount wasn't enormous, but the name attached to the company was familiar. Daniel Mercer. Alexander stared at the document. Daniel Mercer had been part of his business world for years. They had worked together on several projects. Daniel wasn't an employee. He was an independent businessman. Sharp, charismatic, ambitious. He understood investments. He understood wealthy clients. And he understood Alexander. That was what made the discovery unsettling. Alexander asked his financial team to investigate. They found nothing immediately illegal. The transaction had a legitimate explanation on paper, but something didn't feel right. Alexander asked himself, why was Daniel involved? And why had Victoria suddenly started asking questions about his assets? He didn't confront anyone. Instead, he waited. A few weeks later, Alexander discovered something else. Victoria had told him she was attending a charity event in another city. The event existed. Her name was on the guest list. But she hadn't stayed at the hotel where the event was being held. She had stayed somewhere else. Alexander looked at the reservation. Then he saw another name. Daniel Mercer. Same hotel. Same dates. Alexander stared at the screen. His first reaction wasn't anger. It was denial. His mind immediately began creating explanations. Maybe it was business. Maybe Daniel had been there for another reason. Maybe Victoria had simply changed hotels. Maybe it was coincidence. The human mind has a strange ability to protect itself from painful truths. Alexander's mind was no different. He closed the file. He didn't call Victoria. He didn't call Daniel. Instead, he waited. And then he began watching. Over the following weeks, Alexander noticed patterns. Victoria and Daniel met repeatedly. Sometimes during the day. Sometimes late at night. Sometimes at restaurants. Sometimes in hotels. Sometimes in places where neither expected to be recognized. Alexander never confronted them. He simply gathered information. Then came the messages. At first, they were affectionate. Then personal. Then unmistakable. There was no longer any reasonable explanation. Victoria was having an affair. Alexander sat alone in his office after reading the messages. Outside, the city was glowing. Thousands of windows. Thousands of people. Millions of lives. Yet Alexander felt completely alone. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He didn't throw anything. He simply stared at the screen. Because the pain wasn't really about Daniel. It was about Victoria, the woman he had trusted more than anyone. Then Alexander discovered something far more troubling. The conversation wasn't only about their relationship. It was about him, his assets, his properties, his businesses, his estate, and what Victoria might receive if the marriage ended. Alexander stopped reading. He leaned back. Suddenly, the affair no longer seemed like the main problem. It seemed like the beginning of something much larger. Alexander asked himself a difficult question. Was Victoria simply preparing for a divorce? Or were she and Daniel planning to benefit financially from the marriage ending? He refused to assume. So he hired an attorney. The attorney reviewed everything. Property records, financial arrangements, business structures, messages, dates, meetings. At first, they found nothing proving theft. Nothing clearly demonstrated a crime. But they found a pattern. Victoria had become interested in assets she had never previously discussed. Daniel had asked questions about some of the same assets. Again, not proof, but concerning. The attorney looked at Alexander. Do you want to confront her? Alexander shook his head. Not yet. Why? Alexander stared at the documents. Because if I confront her now, I'll get a story. The attorney waited. I don't want a story. Alexander looked up. I want the truth. So they waited. Then something happened that changed everything. Alexander's security team contacted him. Victoria had left the mansion. She drove to a quiet location. Daniel arrived shortly afterward. Security footage showed them talking. Daniel handed Victoria an envelope. Victoria opened it. Her expression changed. They continued talking. The audio was faint. Most of the conversation couldn't be heard. Then one sentence became clear. Daniel asked, "When does he find out?" Victoria answered, "He won't." Alexander stared at the screen. For several seconds. He didn't move. Then he turned off the monitor. The room became dark. Alexander sat alone and made 3 calls. The first, to his attorney. The second, to his financial advisor. The third, to a security professional. He wasn't planning revenge. He wasn't going to threaten anyone. He wasn't going to destroy Victoria's life. He simply needed to protect himself and understand exactly what was happening. The next morning, Alexander asked his attorney about the envelope. They couldn't see what was inside. But a few days later, a document appeared in a business file. It referenced one of Alexander's properties, the same property Daniel had previously asked about. The attorney placed the document on Alexander's desk. "This is the first thing that concerns me." Alexander read it. "Why?" "Because Daniel shouldn't have access to this information." Alexander looked up. Could someone have given it to him? Possibly. Who? The attorney paused. "That's what we need to find out." Alexander immediately thought of Victoria, but he didn't accuse her. Instead, he ordered his team to reconstruct the chain of access. Who had seen the document? Who had copied it? Who had requested it? Who had downloaded it? Who had sent it? The investigation continued. Days became weeks, and every new discovery made the situation more uncomfortable. There wasn't one dramatic transaction. There wasn't one giant transfer. There wasn't one obvious act of theft. Instead, there were small pieces. Questions, meetings, documents, conversations, financial discussions. And together, they created a picture. Victoria and Daniel had been planning around Alexander's wealth, but they didn't fully understand the structure of that wealth. They knew about the mansion, several properties, certain businesses, but Alexander's fortune was far more complicated. Companies owned companies. Properties were held through separate entities. Investments were diversified. Long-term agreements were protected by professional structures. Alexander's wealth wasn't one pile of money. It was a network, a carefully constructed network. And Victoria and Daniel had been planning around a picture that was incomplete. That mistake would eventually become important. But Alexander still needed to know one thing. How far had they gone? 2 days later, Victoria walked into the dining room expecting dinner. Instead, Alexander was sitting alone. There was a folder on the table. Victoria stopped. "What is that?" Alexander looked at her. "Sit down." She hesitated, then slowly sat. Alexander opened the folder. Hotel reservations, financial records, photographs, messages, meeting dates. Victoria's face became pale. She understood immediately. Alexander knew. She tried to remain calm. "You've been going through my things?" Alexander shook his head. "No." He pushed one document toward her. "This isn't about your phone." Another. "It's about where you've been." Another. "And who you've been meeting." Victoria stared at the papers. "Alexander." "How long?" She looked away. "How long has it been?" "I don't know." "You don't know?" "It just happened." Alexander almost smiled. Not because it was funny, because the sentence sounded so familiar. It just happened. He looked directly at her. "How many times?" Victoria remained silent. "How many hotel rooms?" She closed her eyes, then finally whispered, "Daniel and I." She couldn't finish. Alexander completed the sentence. "You were having an affair." Victoria nodded. Silence filled the room. Alexander sat back. For a moment, there was no anger, only exhaustion. Then Victoria spoke. "I was unhappy." Alexander looked at her. "For how long?" "A long time." "Then why didn't you leave?" She didn't answer. "Why did you stay?" "I'm afraid." "Afraid of what?" She looked at him. "My future." Alexander's expression hardened. "Your future?" She swallowed. "I didn't know what would happen." "After the divorce?" "Yes." Alexander nodded. Then he placed another document on the table. "That's why you were asking about my assets." Victoria stared at it. "I wanted security." Alexander's voice became quieter. "Security?" "Yes." "You were planning your security with my money." Victoria became defensive. "I was your wife." "You were." The silence became painful. Then Alexander said something Victoria would remember for the rest of her life. "I could forgive you for falling out of love with me." Victoria looked at him. "But I don't know if I can forgive you for making me wonder whether you ever loved me at all." Victoria began crying. "Alexander." He stood. She looked up. "Is there nothing I can say?" Alexander paused. "I don't know." Then he walked away. The confrontation ended the marriage emotionally. But the legal questions remained. Alexander's attorneys continued examining the records. They discovered something unexpected. A third party had been contacted about one of Alexander's properties. The person who made the inquiry had no obvious reason to be involved. But the name connected back to Daniel. The attorney placed the document on the table. Alexander read it twice. "This changes things." "How?" "We're no longer dealing only with what Victoria said." He pointed to the record. "We have a timeline." The timeline showed something disturbing. Daniel had been gathering information about Alexander's assets before the divorce. Victoria had been asking similar questions. Their meetings had increased. Their financial discussions had become more specific. And their hotel meetings had happened during the same period. Still, Alexander refused to exaggerate. There was a difference between suspicious behavior and proven wrongdoing. He told his attorney, "I don't want a story that makes me feel better." The attorney looked at him. "What do you want?" "The truth." That became Alexander's guiding principle. He didn't want revenge. He wanted clarity. And eventually, the truth became clear enough. Victoria had been preparing for a future after Alexander. Daniel had been involved. And both had underestimated the complexity of Alexander's finances. Their biggest mistake wasn't necessarily the affair. It was believing Alexander's wealth was simple. It wasn't. The divorce became public months later. The headlines were carefully worded. A billionaire couple ending a 12-year marriage. A private family matter. Irreconcilable differences. No dramatic public accusations. No television interviews. No public war. Alexander refused to turn his personal pain into entertainment. Victoria remained mostly silent. But rumors spread. People talked. Some believed the marriage had simply fallen apart. Others suspected an affair. A few people knew there had been financial questions. Almost nobody knew the full story. Victoria's social life changed. Friends who once invited her everywhere became cautious. People who had admired her suddenly became distant. And Daniel? Daniel became less available. At first, Victoria believed he was overwhelmed. Then she realized something. Daniel was protecting himself. The man who had once promised, "We'll build a future together," was now talking about lawyers, documents, his own finances, his reputation. Victoria began to understand something painful. She had risked everything for a man who was now thinking about himself. The future she had imagined wasn't coming. The excitement was gone. The secret meetings were gone. The romantic messages were gone. What remained was reality, and reality was much less glamorous. Alexander continued working. His companies continued growing. His investments continued. His charitable foundation remained active. From the outside, he looked fine, but those closest to him noticed the change. He trusted fewer people. He became more private. He stopped discussing his personal life. He reviewed everything. Contracts, accounts, relationships, even friendships. The betrayal hadn't destroyed him, but it had changed him. One evening, months after the divorce, Alexander returned to an old study. The room had been mostly unused. He was looking for an old business document when he opened a drawer. Inside was a letter, his own handwriting. He recognized it immediately. He had written it years earlier, before the affair, before Daniel, before the divorce. He opened it. The letter was about Victoria. He wrote about the first time they met, her laugh, their first trip, their wedding, the difficult moments, the quiet mornings, the private jokes, the dreams they had discussed. Then he reached one sentence. He stopped. He had written, "I finally found someone who makes me forget what money can and cannot buy." Alexander read that sentence several times. Then he continued. He had written about trust, about feeling safe, about believing Victoria loved him for himself, not his companies, not his properties, not his wealth. Him. Alexander lowered the letter. For the first time since the divorce, he allowed himself to ask the question he had avoided. Were the happy years real? Had Victoria loved him? Had something changed? Or had he simply failed to see who she really was? There was no answer. And perhaps there never would be. Alexander folded the letter. He returned it to the drawer. He didn't destroy it. because those memories belonged to him, even if the person who shared them with him had changed. Victoria eventually understood something too. She had believed Alexander's wealth was the foundation of their marriage. It wasn't. The foundation had been trust. And once that disappeared, everything else became meaningless. The mansion couldn't save the marriage. The vacations couldn't save it. The jewelry couldn't save it. The social status couldn't save it. And Daniel couldn't save it. Because Victoria had been chasing security, while destroying the one thing that had already given her security, a relationship with someone who trusted her. She eventually moved away from the social world she had once enjoyed. She lived more privately. She rarely spoke publicly about Alexander. When people asked about the marriage, she avoided details. Perhaps because some truths are difficult to explain, without admitting your own role in them. Daniel disappeared from her life too. The relationship that had once seemed exciting became a painful reminder. A reminder of what she had risked. A reminder of what she had lost. And perhaps most painfully, a reminder that the man she thought would save her future had never promised to sacrifice his own for hers. Years passed. Alexander moved forward. But moving forward didn't mean forgetting. There were moments when memories returned unexpectedly. A restaurant, a song, a photograph, a place they had visited, a date on the calendar, a sentence from an old letter. Betrayal has a strange way of doing that. It doesn't always hurt continuously. Sometimes it disappears for weeks, then returns in a single moment. Alexander eventually realized something. The hardest part wasn't losing Victoria. It was losing the version of himself who had believed completely in the marriage. Before the betrayal, Alexander trusted easily. Not everyone, but the people closest to him. Afterward, he questioned everything. A delayed phone call, a private conversation, a business associate asking unusual questions, a friend behaving differently. His mind became trained to look for hidden motives. And he didn't like that version of himself. One night, Alexander was speaking with an old friend. The friend asked, "Do you think you'll ever marry again?" Alexander smiled. "I don't know. Do you still believe in marriage?" Alexander thought for several seconds. "Yes." His friend looked surprised. "After everything?" Alexander nodded. "After everything." "Why?" Alexander looked out the window. "Because one person's choices don't define the entire idea." He paused. "Victoria made her choices, and I have to make mine." That was the beginning of Alexander's healing. Alexander had spent his entire life building things. Businesses, companies, properties, investments, a fortune, a reputation. But he discovered that the hardest thing to rebuild wasn't financial. It was trust. Money could replace a house. Money could replace a car. Money could replace an investment. Money could even rebuild a business. But money couldn't answer one question. Did she ever truly love me? There was no price for that answer. No accountant could calculate it. No attorney could uncover it completely. No security system could protect it. And no billionaire could buy certainty. Eventually, Alexander stopped asking. Not because he found the answer, because he realized he didn't need one to move forward. Years earlier, Alexander had believed the greatest risk in life was losing his fortune. He was wrong. The greatest risk wasn't trusting people. It was trusting the wrong person completely. And there's an important distinction. Trust isn't weakness. Trust is courage. When you trust someone, you give them access to parts of your life they could destroy. Your secrets, your fears, your future, your reputation, your heart. That's why betrayal hurts so deeply. It doesn't only change the future. It changes the meaning of the past. You look at old photographs differently. You remember old conversations. You replay promises. You question moments that once seemed ordinary. You ask yourself, was that real? Did they mean it? How long had this been happening? How did I not notice? Alexander never found all the answers. But eventually, he stopped needing them. Alexander eventually understood something his younger self could never have imagined. Security isn't the absence of risk. Security is knowing that even when something breaks, you can rebuild. His marriage broke. He rebuilt. His trust was damaged. He rebuilt. His understanding of love changed. He rebuilt. And perhaps, that was the greatest lesson of all. You don't always get to choose what someone does to you, but you get to choose what you do afterward. Alexander could have spent the rest of his life trying to punish Victoria. He could have turned the divorce into a public spectacle. He could have destroyed Daniel's reputation. He could have used his wealth to make both of them suffer. But he chose something else. Silence. Distance. Healing. And eventually, purpose. He returned to charity work. He spent more time with people he trusted. He traveled. He invested in new projects. He supported causes that mattered to him. He began mentoring young entrepreneurs. And slowly, the man who had once measured success in billions began measuring it differently. Success became waking up without anger. Success became trusting a friend again. Success became laughing without thinking about what had happened. Success became being comfortable with his own life. There was one question Alexander never completely answered. Did Victoria ever love him? Perhaps she did. Perhaps she didn't. Perhaps she had loved him once and changed. Perhaps fear had changed her. Perhaps ambition had changed her. Perhaps the relationship with Daniel had begun as an emotional escape and eventually became something more dangerous. Perhaps Victoria herself didn't fully understand when the line had been crossed. But none of those possibilities changed the outcome. Trust had been broken. And once trust was gone, the marriage couldn't survive. Alexander eventually accepted something painful. Sometimes you don't receive a satisfying explanation. Sometimes people hurt you for reasons that don't make sense. Sometimes you can spend years analyzing every conversation and still never understand another person's choices. And that's okay, because healing doesn't require complete understanding. It requires acceptance. Acceptance that the past happened. Acceptance that you cannot change it. Acceptance that someone else's choices are not a measurement of your worth. Victoria's betrayal didn't mean Alexander wasn't enough. It meant Victoria made choices. Choices she had to live with. And Alexander had choices too. He could remain trapped in the past. Or he could build something new. He chose to build. Again. Just as he had when his first company failed. Just as he had when his second company struggled. Just as he had when everyone told him he should give up. Alexander rebuilt his life. Not around money. Around meaning. And perhaps that's what makes this story so unsettling. Alexander Grant had everything people spend their entire lives chasing. Money, success, security, influence, a beautiful home, a successful career. And yet, none of it protected him from betrayal. Because betrayal doesn't care how much money you have. It doesn't care how successful you are. It doesn't care how many security cameras surround your house. You can protect your bank account. You can protect your property. You can protect your business. But you cannot completely protect your heart. Eventually, you have to trust someone. And when that trust is broken, the damage isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in questions. Questions that can stay with you for years. Alexander eventually understood that the greatest fortune wasn't sitting inside his bank accounts. It wasn't hidden inside his companies. It wasn't represented by the mansion. It wasn't the private aircraft. It wasn't the investments. It wasn't even the billions. His greatest fortune was his ability to rebuild. Because money had helped him build his first company. But resilience had helped him rebuild after it failed. Money had built the mansion. But courage had helped him walk through it alone after the marriage ended. Money had created security. But wisdom taught him what security actually meant. Security wasn't having enough money to prevent bad things from happening. Security was knowing that when something terrible happened, he would still have the strength to stand. And now, we return to that Thursday night. 11:47. Victoria is standing at the top of the staircase. Her phone in her hand. The message still glowing on the screen. He knows everything. She watched Alexander enter the house. The second vehicle remained behind him. The passenger door opened. A man stepped out. It was Alexander's attorney. Victoria's heart sank. Alexander walked toward the front door. He didn't look angry. That frightened her more than anger would have. The door opened. Alexander entered. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Victoria looked at him. Alexander looked back. Then he said, "Victoria." She swallowed. "Yes. We need to talk." She already knew. The truth had finally arrived. Not with police. Not with shouting. Not with violence. Not with revenge. Just a husband, standing in his own home, holding the truth about his marriage. And Victoria realized something. For months, she had been afraid Alexander would discover the affair. But now that he had, she understood that the affair wasn't the only thing he had discovered. He had discovered the lies, the secret meetings, the financial questions, the conversations, the planning, and most painfully, he had discovered that the woman he trusted most had been living a second life behind his back. Alexander walked past her. He placed the folder on the table. Then he looked at her. "Tell me the truth." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. For the first time, there was nowhere left to hide. Alexander didn't destroy Victoria. He didn't humiliate her publicly. He didn't use his fortune as a weapon. He simply ended the marriage. The legal process took time. There were lawyers, documents, negotiations, property discussions, financial questions. But Alexander insisted that everything be handled properly. No revenge, no manipulation, no public spectacle. When the divorce was finalized, Alexander left the courthouse alone. Reporters waited outside. Cameras flashed. People shouted questions. Alexander, was there another person involved? Did your wife betray you? Are the rumors about financial problems true? Alexander stopped briefly. He could have told them everything. He could have exposed Victoria. He could have told the world about Daniel. He could have released messages. He could have explained the investigation. Instead, he said only, "Some things are better resolved privately." Then he walked away. That decision became one of the most important choices of his life, because revenge would have given him a moment, but dignity gave him a future. Years later, Alexander stood on the balcony of a different home. Not smaller, not less beautiful, just different. The city stretched beneath him. Lights filled the horizon. He remembered the boy he had once been. The boy sitting outside the kitchen, listening to his father say, "We'll figure it out." Alexander smiled, because his father had been right. Life had thrown uncertainty at him again and again. Business failure, financial risk, betrayal, divorce, loss. But every time, he figured it out. He had once believed wealth meant eliminating uncertainty. Now he knew better. Life would always contain uncertainty. People would disappoint you. Plans would fail. Relationships would end. People you loved might make choices you never expected. You could not control all of that. What you could control was what you did next. Alexander had lost a marriage. He had lost certainty. He had lost the version of Victoria he thought he knew. But he hadn't lost himself. And that was what allowed him to begin again. Because sometimes the end of one chapter isn't the end of your story. Sometimes it's the moment you finally learn who you are without the person you thought you couldn't live without. And sometimes the greatest victory isn't revenge. It's moving forward, without becoming the person who hurt you. So now, let me ask you, if you discovered that your spouse had secretly betrayed you, what would you do? Would you confront them immediately? Or would you remain quiet, gather the evidence, and wait until you knew everything? Would you want the truth immediately, even if the truth destroyed the marriage? Or would you rather live with uncertainty? And if you were Victoria, do you believe the marriage could have been saved? Was her betrayal unforgivable? Or do you believe people sometimes make terrible decisions because they're afraid of what comes next? And perhaps the biggest question is this. If you were Alexander, would you ever trust someone completely again? Tell us what you think in the comments. Because stories like this aren't really about billionaires. They're about people. They're about trust, fear, love, greed, choices, and consequences. Alexander had everything money could buy, but when the person he trusted most betrayed him, he discovered something money could never purchase: trust. And once trust is broken, no fortune in the world can simply buy it back. Alexander lost a marriage. He lost certainty. He lost the version of Victoria he thought he knew. But he didn't lose himself. And that was his greatest victory. So if this story made you think about trust, relationships, wealth, and the secrets people sometimes hide from those closest to them, make sure you like this video. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story. 3 years had passed since Alexander Grant's divorce. 3 years since the night Victoria had sat across from him at the dining table. 3 years since the folder, the hotel records, the photographs, the messages, the lies. Alexander had moved on. At least, that's what everyone believed. His companies had continued to grow. His foundation had expanded. He had become even more private. And slowly, his name disappeared from the headlines. That was exactly how Alexander wanted it. He no longer wanted people discussing his marriage. He no longer wanted strangers analyzing his personal life. He had learned that wealth attracted attention, but silence could sometimes protect peace. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, his private phone rang. Alexander was sitting in his office overlooking Manhattan. It was 8:16 in the morning. His assistant usually screened every call, but this number had bypassed the system. Alexander answered. Alexander Grant. There was silence. Then a man's voice. "You don't know me." Alexander leaned back. "Who is this?" "My name is Michael Reeves." Alexander didn't recognize the name. "What do you want?" "I think you need to know something about Daniel Mercer." Alexander's expression changed. For 3 years, he hadn't heard Daniel's name spoken to him directly. He had deliberately avoided it. Go on. The man hesitated. Daniel wasn't only interested in your marriage. Alexander said nothing. He was interested in your company. Alexander's eyes narrowed. What exactly are you saying? I'm saying the affair wasn't the beginning. A pause. It was the cover. Alexander stood. What does that mean? I think you should look at something Daniel was doing before Victoria ever met him. Alexander's voice became colder. Why are you telling me this now? The man answered. Because I'm dying. Alexander froze. What? I have a serious illness. I don't have much time. Another pause. And there are things I don't want to take with me. The call ended. Alexander stood behind his desk. He stared at the phone. For several seconds. He didn't move. Then he pressed the intercom. Cancel my morning meetings. His assistant responded immediately. All of them. All of them. Alexander looked toward the city. Something he thought had ended 3 years ago might never have been what he believed. That afternoon, Alexander met Michael Reeves at a quiet private club. Michael was in his late 60s. He looked tired, much older than Alexander expected. They sat across from each other in a private room. Michael placed a brown envelope on the table. Alexander didn't touch it. What's inside? Copies. Of what? Documents. Michael looked directly at him. Before Daniel became involved with Victoria, he was already studying your businesses. Alexander remained silent. Michael continued. Not publicly. Quietly. Why? I don't know exactly. Then why should I believe you? Michael reached into his jacket. He pulled out an old photograph. It showed Daniel standing beside several businessmen at a conference. Alexander recognized 2 of them immediately. They had been involved in one of his earliest investment deals. Alexander looked at Michael. When was this? 7 years ago. Alexander stared at the photograph. That was before the affair. Before Victoria. Before the hotel rooms. Before everything. What happened? Michael lowered his voice. Daniel was trying to get information about how your companies were structured. Alexander's expression hardened. Why? Because he believed there was a weakness. A weakness. A company structure that could be exploited. Alexander opened the envelope. Inside were copies of emails, old contracts, meeting records, financial diagrams, and one handwritten note. Alexander read it. His eyes narrowed. The note referenced one of his companies, but it wasn't written by Daniel. Alexander recognized the handwriting. Victoria. He slowly placed the paper down. Where did you get this? Michael answered. I worked with Daniel. Alexander looked up. For how long? Almost 5 years. And you waited until now? I was afraid. Of Daniel. Michael nodded. He wasn't the man people thought he was. Alexander leaned forward. What did he want? Michael took a breath. Access. To what? Everything. Alexander returned to his office that evening. He locked the door. He placed every document Michael had given him across the conference table. Then he began reading. One document. Then another. Then another. The deeper he went, the stranger the story became. Daniel had studied Alexander's business structure years before the affair. He had researched properties, investment entities, ownership structures, board relationships, even personal connections. But there was one thing Alexander couldn't understand. Why Victoria? Why had Daniel needed her? Then he found the answer. A document dated 6 years earlier. Alexander stared at it. Victoria's name appeared beside Daniel's. But the date was impossible. It was nearly a year before Alexander had even suspected anything. Alexander sat down. He read it again. Then a third time. Victoria had been connected to Daniel financially before the affair began. Not romantically, not publicly, but through a small consulting company. A company Alexander had never heard of. Alexander immediately called his attorney. I need you in my office. Tonight. Tonight. The attorney arrived 40 minutes later. Alexander pushed the documents toward him. Look at this. The attorney read silently. His expression changed. Where did you get these? Someone gave them to me. Are they authentic? I don't know. The attorney looked at Alexander. Then we verify everything. Alexander nodded. There's something else. He handed him another document. This company. The attorney studied it. Who owns it? That's what I want to know. The attorney began investigating. Minutes passed. Then he looked up. Alexander. What? The company was dissolved. When? 4 years ago. Who owned it? The attorney hesitated. An individual named Laura Bennett. Alexander frowned. Who is that? I don't know. Alexander stared at him. Find out. 2 days later, Alexander received a photograph. Laura Bennett, a woman in her early 50s, former accountant, former financial consultant, former employee of a company Daniel had worked with. Alexander studied the photograph. Something about her name seemed familiar. Then his attorney explained why. Laura Bennett worked for one of your investment partners. Alexander looked up. During the period when Daniel first became interested in your companies. Alexander stood. Bring her in. They found Laura living quietly outside the city. She initially refused to speak. Then Alexander sent a message. Not a threat. Not an offer. Just one sentence. I need to understand what happened. Laura agreed to meet. They sat in a small cafe. Laura looked nervous. I knew this day would come. Alexander stared at her. What do you know about Daniel? More than I wanted to. Did he steal from me? I don't know. Did he try? Laura looked down. I think he was planning something. What? Something involving your companies. Alexander waited. Laura continued. Daniel believed your business structure was vulnerable. Alexander said nothing. He believed that if someone could gain access to certain internal documents, they could manipulate the ownership structure. Alexander's face became serious. Who? Laura looked at him. Victoria. The word hung between them. Alexander closed his eyes briefly. Laura continued. Daniel needed someone close to you. Someone you trusted. Yes. And Victoria? Laura nodded. She was perfect. Alexander felt something inside him tighten. You're saying Daniel targeted my wife? I think he targeted your life. Laura revealed something Alexander had never known. Daniel had a pattern. He didn't simply enter people's lives because he liked them. He studied them. He identified wealthy people, learned their habits, learned their weaknesses, learned who they trusted. Then he positioned himself close enough to benefit, sometimes through business, sometimes through friendship, and sometimes through relationships. Alexander listened carefully. Was Victoria part of that plan? Laura hesitated. At first, I don't think she knew everything. Then what changed? She became emotionally involved. Alexander looked away. Laura continued. Daniel realized she was unhappy, or he made her unhappy. Alexander looked back. What do you mean? He asked questions. What kind? Questions about your marriage. Alexander's expression hardened. How often were you home? How much time did you spend with her? Did you trust her? Did she have access to your personal accounts? Alexander slowly understood. Daniel hadn't simply discovered Victoria. He had studied her. He had identified her fears, her insecurities, her dissatisfaction, her desire for security. And then, he had offered himself as the solution. Alexander asked, did Victoria know about his plan? Laura answered carefully. Eventually. That word stayed with Alexander. Eventually. It meant there had been a point when Victoria could have walked away. And she hadn't. Victoria was living quietly now. She had moved away from the social world. She rarely attended large events. She had stopped speaking to most of the people she once knew. One evening, there was a knock on her door. Victoria opened it and froze. Laura Bennett stood outside. Victoria hadn't seen her in years. Why are you here? We need to talk. Victoria's expression changed. About what? Alexander. Victoria stepped backward. You shouldn't be here. Laura entered. He's found out. Victoria stared at her. Found out what? Everything. Victoria's face went pale. What did you tell him? The truth. Victoria's voice became quiet. Which truth? Laura looked at her. The part you never told him. Victoria sat down. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Victoria whispered, I never wanted it to go this far. Laura shook her head. But it did. I was scared. I know. I didn't know what Daniel was doing at first. And later, Victoria looked away. I knew. Laura's expression softened. Why didn't you stop him? Victoria's eyes filled with tears. Because by then I was already trapped. Trapped how? Victoria didn't answer. Laura stood. Daniel isn't your friend. Victoria looked up. Where is he? Laura paused. He's been preparing for this. Preparing for what? Your divorce. Victoria stared at her. That's already happened. Laura shook her head. No. Daniel didn't want your divorce. He wanted what came after it. Daniel Mercer had disappeared from public life. At least, that's what everyone believed. But Alexander's investigators eventually found him. He was living under a different business arrangement in another state. Still wealthy. Still connected. Still operating quietly. Alexander didn't want to confront him. Not yet. Instead, he wanted answers. His attorney warned him. If Daniel is dangerous financially, we need to understand his network before we approach him. Alexander agreed. The investigation uncovered several companies. Some were legitimate. Others were difficult to understand. One company had links to international investors. Another had ties to property development. A third had received money from a private investment group. Alexander studied the names. Then one name caught his attention. The same company that had once appeared in Victoria's records. Alexander leaned forward. That's it. His attorney looked at him. What? That's the connection. Between Daniel and Victoria? No. Alexander pointed to the document. Between Daniel and someone else. Who? Alexander didn't answer immediately, because the name belonged to someone he knew. Someone he had trusted. Someone who had been inside his business empire for almost a decade. Alexander called an emergency meeting. Only 4 people were invited. His attorney, his chief financial officer, his security director, and his longtime business advisor. The room was silent. Alexander placed the document on the table. I believe someone inside my organization has been feeding Daniel information. Everyone looked at him. His advisor spoke. Do we know who? Not yet. Then how do we find out? Alexander looked around the room. We give different people different information. His attorney understood immediately. You want to identify the leak. Exactly. They created 4 versions of a confidential business plan. Each version contained slightly different information. Each was shown to one person. Then they waited. 3 days later, Daniel's company made an inquiry about a property. The information in the inquiry matched one of the confidential versions. Alexander knew exactly which person had received it. The room went silent. His advisor looked shocked. You're sure? Alexander nodded. We have the evidence. The man lowered his head. Alexander looked at him. How long? The man didn't answer. How long have you been giving information to Daniel? Finally, the man whispered. 2 years. Alexander's face hardened. Why? Money. How much? The man looked ashamed. More than you would believe. Alexander shook his head. It was never about the money. The man looked confused. What do you mean? You had everything. You had a career. You had my trust. And you sold it. The investigation now revealed something much larger. Daniel had never been interested in Alexander's money alone. He wanted leverage. He wanted information. He wanted access. And Victoria had unknowingly, or eventually knowingly, helped create that access. But there was still one unanswered question. What was Daniel ultimately planning to do? The answer came from a recovered document. It was a business strategy, a plan to acquire distressed assets connected to several companies Alexander controlled. The plan depended on inside information. If Daniel knew when Alexander intended to sell certain properties, he could position himself ahead of the transactions. If he knew which companies were restructuring, he could profit. If he knew which assets Alexander planned to protect, he could move against them. It was sophisticated, but incomplete. Because Alexander had changed his financial structures years earlier, Daniel had been planning around outdated information. Alexander realized something. The affair had distracted everyone. The romance, the secrecy, the hotel rooms, the emotional betrayal. But behind it, there had been a financial strategy. Victoria had been useful because she was close to Alexander. Daniel had been useful because he understood business. And the insider had been useful because he had access. 3 people, 3 motivations, 1 plan. But the plan had failed. Alexander now had enough evidence to destroy Daniel publicly. He could expose everything. He could release the documents. He could make the story impossible for Daniel to escape. But Alexander remembered the night of the divorce. He remembered the reporters, the cameras, the questions, and his own decision. Some things are better resolved privately. So he made another decision. He would let the evidence speak for itself. His attorneys contacted the appropriate authorities and professionals. The investigation moved beyond Alexander's personal life. Daniel's business dealings were examined. The insider faced the consequences of his actions. And Victoria had to face a different kind of truth. Not a courtroom, not a headline, but herself. One evening, Victoria sat alone in her apartment. On the table was an old photograph. It showed her and Alexander during their first year of marriage. They were laughing, young, happy, unaware of what would eventually happen. Victoria stared at the photograph. Then she whispered, I'm sorry, but no one heard her. And perhaps that was the hardest part. There was no audience, no dramatic forgiveness, no cinematic reconciliation, Just a woman finally understanding the consequences of choices she could never undo. Several weeks later, Alexander received an envelope. There was no return address. He opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter. From Victoria. Alexander almost threw it away. Instead, he read it. She didn't ask for money. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't blame Daniel. For the first time, she blamed herself. She wrote about the night they first met. The charity event. The conversation. The joke about Alexander's terrible answer. She remembered their wedding. Their first home. The vacations. His mother's illness. The mornings when they drank coffee together. The moments she had once considered ordinary. Then she wrote, I spent so much time worrying about what I would lose that I never realized what I already had. Alexander stopped reading. He stared at the sentence. Then continued. Victoria admitted she had been afraid. Afraid of aging. Afraid of losing her lifestyle. Afraid of being alone. Afraid of becoming someone people no longer admired. Daniel had understood those fears. And instead of helping her overcome them, he had used them. But Victoria acknowledged something important. He didn't force me. Alexander read that line twice. I made choices. The letter continued. I can't ask you to forgive me. I can't ask you to remember me as the woman you married. But I hope one day you remember that not every moment was a lie. Alexander lowered the letter. For a long time, he sat silently. Then he folded it. He placed it beside the old letter he had written years earlier. He didn't respond. Not because he hated her, but because some chapters don't need another conversation. They need to remain closed. Months later, Alexander received another message. This time, from Daniel. One sentence. We should talk. Alexander almost ignored it. Then he agreed. They met in a quiet private office. Daniel looked older, less confident. The arrogance was gone. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Daniel said, You probably hate me. Alexander shook his head. No. Daniel looked surprised. I don't hate you. Then what do you feel? Alexander thought about it. Nothing. Daniel looked away. That's worse. Maybe. Daniel took a breath. I never thought it would become this complicated. Alexander looked directly at him. You knew exactly what you were doing. Daniel didn't answer. You studied my businesses. Silence. You studied my marriage. Silence. You used Victoria. Daniel finally spoke. I loved her. Alexander's expression didn't change. Maybe. Daniel looked up. But you also used her. Daniel couldn't deny it. Alexander continued. You told her what she wanted to hear. You made her believe you could give her the future she wanted. And while she was looking at you, you were looking at my assets. Daniel's face hardened. You don't understand. Alexander stood. No. I understand perfectly. Then he walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned. That's the difference between us. I spent my life building something. You spent yours looking for something someone else had already built. And then, Alexander left. Years earlier, Alexander had believed the greatest danger in life was failure. Then he became wealthy. He discovered that success created different dangers. People who wanted his money. People who wanted his influence. People who wanted access. But even after everything, he eventually realized something. The greatest danger wasn't money. It wasn't business. It wasn't betrayal. It was allowing fear to make your decisions for you. Victoria had feared losing her future. That fear influenced her choices. Daniel had feared remaining ordinary. That fear influenced his ambition. The insider had feared losing financial opportunity. That fear influenced his betrayal. And Alexander? Alexander had once feared uncertainty. That fear had driven him to build an empire. But eventually, he learned that uncertainty wasn't something money could eliminate. Life would always contain unknowns. People would always have choices. Relationships would always involve risk. Trust would always require courage. And perhaps, that's what makes trust so valuable. Because you can never guarantee it. You can only give it. And hope the person receiving it understands what it means. Alexander eventually returned to the same lesson his father had taught him when he was a child. We'll figure it out. Not. Nothing bad will happen. Not. Everything will always be safe. Just. We'll figure it out. Alexander finally understood. Security wasn't preventing every disaster. Security was knowing that when disaster came, you could survive it. Alexander never became the man he had been before Victoria. But that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. He became more thoughtful, more careful, more aware of people. But he also became more compassionate. He began speaking to young entrepreneurs about failure. He told them that success wasn't about never falling. It was about learning how to stand again. He funded scholarships. He expanded his charitable foundation. He supported families who were struggling financially. And sometimes, he thought about the kitchen where his father had once sat surrounded by bills. The boy he had been would never have imagined the life ahead. But Alexander had finally understood what his father meant. We'll figure it out. He had figured it out. Not perfectly, not without pain, but enough. Years later, Alexander returned to Manhattan. He attended another charity event. It was held in the same ballroom where he had first met Victoria. For a moment, he stood near the entrance. He remembered everything. The music, the lights, Victoria's smile, her terrible joke about his answer, the beginning, and the ending. But this time, the memory didn't hurt. It was simply a memory. Alexander walked toward the ballroom. A young entrepreneur approached him. "Mr. Grant." Alexander turned. "Yes. I've followed your career for years." "Thank you." The young man hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" Alexander smiled. "Of course. What was the greatest lesson you learned?" Alexander looked around the ballroom. Then he answered, "That success isn't measured by what you can keep." The young man listened. "It's measured by what remains after you've lost something important." He paused. Because life will eventually take something from everyone. Money, relationships, opportunities, people. You can't control that. But you can control what you become afterward. The young man nodded. Alexander smiled, then walked away. The orchestra began playing. The ballroom filled with conversation. Alexander looked toward the doors. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to look back. He walked forward. Because sometimes, the greatest victory isn't making the person who hurt you regret what they did. Sometimes, the greatest victory is reaching a point where their choices no longer control your life. Victoria had once been Alexander's greatest love. Then she became his greatest betrayal. And eventually, she became something else. A chapter. Not his identity. Not his future. Just a chapter. Alexander stepped outside. The city lights stretched across the horizon. He looked upward and smiled. The billionaire who had spent his entire life trying to protect everything had finally learned the one thing no fortune could guarantee: tomorrow. And perhaps that was okay, because he no longer needed guarantees. He had something better: experience, wisdom, resilience, and the knowledge that whatever tomorrow brought, he would figure it out, just like his father had promised all those years ago. "We'll figure it out." And this time, Alexander believed it.